In the dark waters off Mindoro Island in the Philippines, archaeologists found something that shouldn't exist. Stone tools, 40,000 years old, bearing microscopic traces of plant fibers. Fishing hooks carved from bone, net weights fashioned from stone. And most shocking of all, the skeletal remains of deep ocean fish, tuna, sharks, species that live miles from shore in waters so deep and dangerous that harvesting them requires sophisticated boats, advanced rope technology, and navigation skills that would make modern sailors respect their ancient predecessors. But here's what makes this discovery impossible to dismiss. The Philippine Islands were never connected to mainland Asia. Not by land bridges, not by ice sheets, not even during the height of the last ice age, when sea levels dropped hundreds of feet below where they are today. Which means that 40,000 years ago, someone crossed open ocean in boats advanced enough to reach remote islands. And they did it thousands of years before we thought humans possessed that technology. This is the story of how everything we believed about ancient maritime technology just got rewritten. And it all started with microscopic scratches on 40,000-year-old stone tools. The conventional wisdom was simple. Europe and Africa were the centers of technological innovation during the Paleolithic era, the cradle of human advancement, the birthplace of sophisticated tools, complex social structures, and advanced thinking. Southeast Asia. That was where passive sea drifters, on flimsy bamboo rafts, accidentally stumbled onto islands, carried by currents and luck rather than skill and planning. But Dr. Ritza Fuentes and Dr. Alfred Paulik from Ateneo de Manila University weren't convinced. For 15 years, the Mindoro Archaeology Project systematically excavated sites across the Philippine archipelago, cave after cave, rock shelter after rock shelter, layer after layer of sediment revealing the story of human habitation stretching back into deep time. Elin Island, San Jose, Stana Teresa in Magsaysay. Each location yielded artifacts, but it was the microscopic analysis that changed everything. When they examined stone tools under high-powered magnification, they found something remarkable. Wear patterns, striations, the kind of damage that comes from processing plant materials in very specific ways. These weren't general-purpose tools. They were specialized instruments for extracting plant fibers, the kind of fibers you need to make rope. And rope is the foundation of everything in ancient seafaring. You need it to bind boat components together. You need it for rigging. You need it for fishing nets and lines. Without rope technology, there are no ocean-worthy boats. The stone tools told one part of the story, but it was what else they found at these sites that made the picture complete. Fishing hooks carved from bone. Some were simple J-hooks, others were gorges, straight pieces of bone that would lodge sideways in a fish's throat. Net weights fashioned from carefully shaped stones, each one showing signs of cordage attachment points. These weren't decorative objects. They were working tools, worn smooth by use, practical implements designed by people who understood the ocean intimately. And then there were the fish bones. Most archaeological sites in coastal regions yield fish remains. That's expected. Ancient people fished, but the species matter. Coastal fish, reef fish, shallow water species, those are one thing. But tuna, sharks, bonito, these are pelagic fish, open ocean predators that live miles from shore in deep water where the continental shelf drops away and the ocean floor plunges into darkness. You can't catch these species from shore. You can't wade out and net them in shallow water. You need boats capable of handling open ocean swells. You need knowledge of fish migration patterns and seasonal movements. You need to know where to go, when to go there, and how to get back safely with your catch. The ancient inhabitants of Mindoro weren't just fishing. They were deep-sea fishing, 40,000 years ago. But boats are made of wood and plant fiber, organic materials that decay rapidly, especially in tropical climates where heat and humidity accelerate decomposition. The archaeologists knew they would never find a 40,000-year-old boat. The conditions simply don't allow for that kind of preservation. What they could find were the clues, the indirect evidence, the stone tools that showed fibre processing, the bone hooks and net weights that proved sophisticated fishing techniques, and most importantly, the prey remains that demonstrated these ancient mariners were venturing far offshore. When you put it all together, a picture emerges. These weren't accident-prone drifters hoping for the best. These were skilled navigators who understood boat construction, rope technology, ocean currents, weather patterns, and the behaviour of marine life. They had to be, because the alternative is that they all drowned trying. The Philippine archipelago presents a unique challenge for any maritime culture. Unlike much of Southeast Asia, most of the major islands, except Palawan, were never connected to the mainland. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 25,000 years ago, sea levels dropped by about 400 feet. Vast areas of the Sunda Shelf became dry land, creating land bridges between what are now separate islands. But not the Philippines. Most of the archipelago remained isolated, separated from the mainland by deep water channels that stayed submerged even during the Ice Age. This means human settlement of these islands required water crossings. Not short hops across narrow straits, real ocean voyages across open water with no land visible on the horizon. The kind of journeys where getting lost means death from thirst or exposure long before you accidentally find land. The earliest evidence of anatomically modern humans in the Philippines comes from Taban Cave in Palawan. Multiple radiocarbon dates place human occupation between 10,000 and 39,000 years ago. Skeletal remains of several individuals, all Homo sapiens, have been dated through uranium series analysis to between 16 and 47,000 years before present, though the margin of error on those dates is considerable. But Palawan was potentially accessible via land bridges during periods of lower sea level. The really interesting sites are the ones that were always islands, and the oldest artifacts associated with early modern humans from those truly isolated islands. They come from Bubog 1 on Elin Island in Mindoro, dated to before 33,000 years ago. This site provides the best stratified record of changing environments from the late Pleistocene to the mid-Holocene in the entire Philippine region. Think about what that means. 33,000 years ago, humans were already established on Mindoro. They didn't just arrive, they were thriving, building communities, developing specialized tools, creating a maritime culture sophisticated enough to sustain itself for millennia. The stone tools from these sites tell a fascinating story when examined under microscopic analysis. Each scratch, each wear pattern, each modification to the stone surface reveals information about how the tool was used. And the tools from Mindoro show something remarkable. Systematic plant processing focused specifically on fibre extraction. Different plants produce different fibres with different properties. Some fibres are strong but rigid, others are flexible but weak. Ancient rope makers needed to understand which plants to harvest, when to harvest them, how to process the raw material, and how to twist or braid the fibres into cordage that would hold up to the stresses of boat construction and open ocean use. The process isn't simple. First, you need to identify plants with suitable fibres, then harvest them at the right stage of growth, then extract the fibres through a process called retting, where you soak the plant material to break down the surrounding tissue. Then you separate and clean the fibres, then you dry them properly, and finally you twist them into rope using techniques that took generations to perfect. The stone tools show wear, consistent with scraping, cutting and pounding plant materials. The specific patterns match what you'd expect from fibre processing. And the locations where these tools were found, sites with access to plant species known for producing strong fibres suitable for rope making. But rope alone doesn't make a boat. You need to understand boat construction. And the evidence suggests these ancient builders were working with sophisticated composite materials. Modern experiments with traditional boat-building techniques provide insights into what these ancient vessels might have looked like. The first, long-distance open sea. Watercraft's project, known as FLOW, brought together archaeologists from Ateneo de Manila University and naval architects from the University of Cebu to test hypotheses about ancient boat construction. Using only materials and techniques available 40,000 years ago, they attempted to design and build scaled-down models of what these ancient vessels might have been. No metal tools, no modern adhesives, just plant fibers, wood, stone tools, and human ingenuity. The most likely design is a composite structure, a wooden frame, possibly made from bamboo or other flexible wood species, held together with rope bindings at every joint. The frame would have been covered with some kind of material to provide buoyancy and keep water out. Woven mats, bundled reeds, possibly animal hides, though those would have been precious and difficult to obtain in sufficient quantity. The key innovation is the rope. Every joint, every connection point, every structural element depends on cordage that can withstand the constant flexing and stress of ocean waves. If your rope fails, your boat comes apart. If your knots slip, you sink. This isn't forgiving technology. It requires precision and understanding. And these ancient builders clearly understood it. Because we have the fish bones to prove they succeeded. Deep ocean fish like tuna and sharks follow specific patterns. They migrate based on seasonal changes in water temperature. They concentrate in areas where upwellings bring nutrients from the deep ocean. They follow specific routes that experienced fishermen learn to recognize and predict. Finding tuna and shark remains at archaeological sites 40,000 years old means these ancient fishermen understood ocean ecology well enough to intercept migratory species. They knew when certain fish would be in specific areas. They knew how to get there. They knew how to catch them using bone hooks and weighted lines. And they knew how to get back with their catch before it spoiled in the tropical heat. This requires a level of environmental knowledge that takes generations to accumulate. You can't learn this through trial and error in a single lifetime. Someone had to venture out, find the fish, figure out the patterns, and pass that knowledge down to the next generation. And the next, and the next. The fishing implements found at Mindoro sites show remarkable sophistication. The bone hooks aren't crude approximations. They're carefully shaped tools with proper curves and barbs designed to hold prey securely. The gorges show understanding of fish anatomy and how to lodge a straight piece of bone in a way that prevents the fish from escaping. The net weights are equally impressive. Each one is carefully fashioned from stone, shaped to be heavy enough to sink a net, but not so heavy that it makes the net unusable. They show wear patterns from cordage, meaning they were actually used, not just ceremonial objects, and they appear in sets, suggesting these ancient fishermen were deploying nets large enough to require multiple weights, spaced along the bottom line. This is commercial-scale fishing, not subsistence gathering. These people were bringing in quantities of fish that exceeded immediate consumption needs, which means they either had ways to preserve the catch or they were part of a larger community where specialized fishermen could trade their catch for other goods. The archaeological evidence points to the second option, because the artifacts from Mindoro show connections to a much wider world. Obsidian cutting tools found on Mindoro show chemical compositions matching sources in Palawan, hundreds of miles away across open ocean. This isn't material that drifts on currents or arrives by accident. Obsidian is volcanic glass, prized for its sharp edges and excellent cutting properties. Ancient people valued it highly and were willing to trade for it. Finding Palawan obsidian on Mindoro means there was regular contact between islands, trade networks, communication. The exchange of goods, ideas, and probably people. This isn't isolated island populations developing in complete separation. This is a maritime network connecting distant communities across island Southeast Asia. Even more remarkable, shell adzes from Mindoro show striking similarities to shell tools found as far away as Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. Over 3,000 kilometers of open ocean separate these locations. Yet the tools are nearly identical in design and manufacturing technique. These adzes were made from giant clamshells, Tridacna species that grow to enormous size in tropical waters. The shells were carefully shaped into cutting tools, ground down to create a sharp edge, and then hafted onto wooden handles. The manufacturing technique requires understanding the material properties of shell, which differs significantly from stone. Shell can be abraded into shape, but will crack if struck like stone. You need different techniques for different materials. The fact that people separated by 3,000 kilometers were making virtually identical shell adzes suggests shared knowledge, either through direct contact via trade networks or through common ancestry, with knowledge passed down through generations as populations spread across the region. There's also evidence of shared burial practices. On Elin Island, archaeologists found a human grave dating to approximately 5,000 years ago. The individual was laid to rest in a fetal position, bedded on limestone slabs, with more limestone slabs covering the body. This burial style matches flexed burials found across Southeast Asia, from the mainland to distant islands. The similarities in burial practices suggest shared cultural traditions, ideological beliefs, and social structures. This isn't convergent evolution, where isolated populations independently develop similar practices. The details are too specific, the techniques too consistent. These communities were connected through a web of maritime interaction that spanned thousands of kilometers and persisted for thousands of years. But how is this possible? How do you maintain contact across such vast distances using technology that leaves no trace in the archaeological record? The answer lies in the maritime traditions that still exist in the region today. Modern communities in island Southeast Asia maintain cultural knowledge of traditional navigation, boat building, and ocean travel that stretches back through countless generations. While the specific techniques have evolved over time, the underlying principles remain remarkably consistent. Traditional navigators in the Pacific and Southeast Asian regions use a complex array of environmental cues to find their way across open ocean. The angle of waves provides information about distant land masses. The behavior of seabirds indicates proximity to islands. Cloud formations over islands create distinctive patterns. Ocean currents follow predictable routes. Stars provide fixed reference points for navigation at night. This knowledge isn't written down. It's passed orally from master navigators to apprentices through years of training. And it works. Modern experiments with traditional navigation techniques have proven that skilled navigators can travel thousands of miles across open ocean without instruments and arrive at specific destinations with remarkable accuracy. The ancient mariners of 40,000 years ago would have possessed similar knowledge, perhaps more refined, given that their survival depended on it. Absolutely. A modern navigator who gets lost can radio for help or use emergency equipment. An ancient navigator who got lost died at sea, along with everyone in the boat. So the knowledge had to be precise. The training had to be rigorous. The understanding of ocean ecology, weather patterns, navigation techniques, and boat handling had to be comprehensive. There was no room for error, and we know they succeeded because we have the archaeological evidence of thriving maritime communities established on islands that could only be reached by crossing open ocean. Communities that persisted for thousands of years. Communities that engaged in long-distance trade. Communities that developed sophisticated technologies adapted to coastal and marine environments. The Mindoro sites show continuous human habitation over 35 to 40,000 years. That's not a brief colonization, followed by extinction. That's successful adaptation to a maritime environment, with sustainable subsistence strategies that allowed populations to grow and thrive. The variety of tools found at these sites demonstrates specialized knowledge of multiple marine ecosystems. Shell tools for processing shellfish and other mollusks, bone hooks for line fishing, net weights for net fishing, harpoons for larger prey. Each tool represents accumulated knowledge about specific techniques passed down through generations and refined through experience. The terrestrial animal remains found alongside the marine species show these communities weren't solely dependent on the ocean. They hunted land animals as well, creating a diverse food base that protected against seasonal variations in any single resource. This kind of balanced subsistence strategy indicates sophisticated understanding of resource management and long-term planning. The use of shells as raw material deserves special attention. Starting more than 30,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Mindoro were fashioning tools from giant clamshells. By 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, they had developed this into a specialized craft, creating adzes that were traded across the region. Shell is a challenging material to work with. It's brittle and prone to shattering if worked incorrectly. But when properly shaped and maintained, shell tools can be extremely sharp and effective for woodworking. The ancient craftspeople of Mindoro clearly understood the material properties of different shell species and developed techniques for exploiting those properties. The presence of these shell adzes across island Southeast Asia and into Papua New Guinea suggests Mindoro may have been a manufacturing centre, producing tools for export through maritime trade networks. This indicates economic specialization beyond simple subsistence, with some communities or individuals focusing on craft production, while others provided food and other necessities through trade. Economic specialization requires population density and social organization. You can only support specialist craftspeople if you have enough surplus production to feed people who aren't directly involved in food procurement. This suggests the maritime resources around Mindoro were abundant enough to support a population engaged in diverse activities beyond basic survival. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. This entire sophisticated maritime culture was thriving during the last glacial maximum. Between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, global temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets expanded across the northern hemisphere. Sea levels dropped by 400 feet. Climate zones shifted dramatically. And across much of the world, human populations struggled to survive in increasingly harsh conditions. Yet on Mindoro, the archaeological record shows continuous occupation right through this period. The maritime culture not only survived but appears to have flourished. Why? The ocean is a buffer against climate extremes. While inland temperatures fluctuated wildly and ice sheets ground across continental interiors, tropical oceans maintained relatively stable temperatures. Marine resources remained available even when terrestrial ecosystems were disrupted by climate change. The lower sea levels actually expanded the continental shelf around many islands, creating new shallow water habitats where fish and shellfish could thrive. For maritime cultures, with the technology to exploit these resources, the Ice Age may have been a time of opportunity rather than catastrophe. The archaeological sites on Mindoro show environmental changes recorded in the sediment layers. Pollen analysis reveals shifts in local vegetation as climate changed. Faunal remains show changes in the species present at different time periods. But through all these changes, human occupation persisted. This demonstrates remarkable adaptability. These weren't rigid cultures trapped in unchanging traditions. They modified their subsistence strategies, adjusted their tools, and adapted their practices to changing environmental conditions while maintaining the core maritime knowledge that made their survival possible. And that knowledge was tested during the Ice Age in ways we're only beginning to understand, because lower sea levels meant longer ocean crossings between islands. Many islands that are close to their neighbours today were much more isolated during periods of maximum glaciation. The ancient mariners couldn't simply island hop with land always visible on the horizon. They had to cross open water, sometimes for days, with nothing but their navigation skills and their understanding of ocean patterns to guide them. Yet they maintained their maritime networks. The obsidian from Palawan still appears on Mindoro during Ice Age layers. The shell adzes still show up across the region. The cultural connections persisted even as the physical challenges increased. This suggests their maritime technology wasn't marginal. It wasn't barely adequate. It was robust enough to handle significantly more challenging conditions than they typically faced. Their boats were overbuilt. Their navigation skills exceeded minimum requirements. Their understanding of ocean conditions included worst-case scenarios that they prepared for, even if they didn't encounter them on every voyage. This is the mark of mature technology, not experimental, not provisional. These ancient mariners had been perfecting their craft for so long that they had safety margins built into every aspect of their maritime culture. And they needed them, because one mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of bad luck, and entire boat crews disappeared without trace. We have no record of the failures, the boats that didn't make it to their destinations, the navigators who misread the signs and sailed into storms or wandered, lost until they ran out of water, the communities that attempted to colonize new islands but couldn't sustain themselves and died out without leaving archaeological traces. What we have are the success stories, the communities that made it, the mariners who survived, the cultures that thrived, and their success is even more impressive when you consider the invisible failures that must have happened along the way. Modern experiments with traditional boat designs provide insight into just how challenging these voyages were. In the Flow project, researchers working with naval architects built scale models using period-appropriate materials and techniques. Then they tested them in actual ocean conditions. The boats performed remarkably well. The flexible composite construction allowed them to absorb wave impacts that would have shattered a rigid structure. The rope bindings provided just enough give to distribute stresses throughout the frame. The designs showed inherent stability that prevented capsizing and swells that would have challenged even some modern small craft. But the boats also showed limitations. They required constant maintenance. Rope bindings had to be checked and retightened regularly. The plant fibre cordage absorbed water and swelled, requiring adjustments. Leaks had to be located and patched. These weren't fire and forget technology. They demanded attention and skill from everyone aboard, which means every successful voyage required not just one skilled boat builder or navigator, but an entire crew with comprehensive understanding of the technology. Everyone needed to know how to repair damage, how to handle the vessel in different conditions, how to recognize problems before they became catastrophes. This level of maritime competence across entire communities represents generations of accumulated knowledge. You don't develop this overnight. You don't learn it from a manual. This is cultural knowledge, transmitted through apprenticeship and practice, refined through experience, and occasionally through tragedy. The communities that succeeded in establishing themselves on remote islands weren't lucky. They were highly skilled, and that skill came at a cost measured in generations of learning, experimentation, and the lives of those who didn't make it. But once established, these maritime cultures created something unprecedented in human history, a civilization based not on land but on the ocean. A network of communities connected not by roads but by sea routes. A culture where boats were as fundamental as buildings, where navigation was as important as agriculture, where understanding the ocean was as necessary as understanding the land. This challenges everything we thought about the development of complex human societies. The traditional narrative places civilization's origins in river valleys and fertile plains. Agriculture leading to settlements, settlements leading to cities, cities leading to states and empires. The ocean is peripheral in this story, something that coastal peoples exploited, but not something that defined them. But in island Southeast Asia 40,000 years ago, the ocean wasn't peripheral, it was central. These communities were fundamentally maritime in ways that most later civilizations never matched. They had to be. Their survival depended on it. And this raises profound questions about human migration and the peopling of the globe. How many other supposedly primitive migrations were actually sophisticated maritime expansions? How many islands were reached not by accidental drift but by purposeful exploration? How many discoveries were actually rediscoveries of places that earlier maritime cultures had already explored and abandoned? The archaeological evidence from Mindoro suggests that human maritime capabilities date back far earlier than anyone believed possible. If people in Southeast Asia were building ocean-worthy boats 40,000 years ago, what else might they have accomplished that left no trace in the archaeological record? The settlement of Australia dates back at least 65,000 years. That required crossing significant stretches of open ocean, even during periods of lowest sea level. Were those crossings made by skilled navigators in capable boats, or by accidental castaways on makeshift rafts? The Mindoro evidence suggests we should reconsider the maritime capabilities of these ancient populations. The settlement of the Pacific Islands occurred much later, with most islands reached within the last few thousand years. But the techniques used by Polynesian and Micronesian navigators show remarkable sophistication. Double-hulled canoes capable of carrying dozens of people and months of supplies. Navigation systems that could pinpoint islands across thousands of miles of open ocean. Were these innovations developed recently, or were they refinements of much older maritime traditions? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Technology evolves, designs improve, techniques are refined. But the fundamental knowledge, understanding that you can cross oceans, that islands exist beyond the horizon, that the ocean follows patterns that can be learned and exploited, that knowledge may be far more ancient than we ever suspected. The plant-working technology found in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Timor-Leste suggests a shared maritime tradition stretching across island Southeast Asia and probably beyond. This wasn't isolated innovation happening independently in different locations. This was cultural knowledge spreading through maritime networks, carried by people who understood that the ocean connected rather than separated. Modern genetic studies support this picture. DNA analysis of Pacific Island populations shows multiple waves of migration from Southeast Asia over thousands of years. These weren't one-time events but ongoing processes, with continuous contact and exchange between island populations and mainland Southeast Asia. The archaeological evidence from Mindoro fits perfectly into this larger pattern. These weren't isolated communities cut off from the world. They were nodes in a vast maritime network that spanned thousands of kilometers and persisted for thousands of years. They participated in trade, exchanged ideas and technologies, and maintained cultural connections across distances that would have seemed impossible to anyone not adapted to maritime life. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. They did all of this without metal tools, without written language, without any of the technologies we associate with advanced civilizations. Just stone, bone, shell, and plant fibers. And human ingenuity refined over countless generations. The story of Mindoro's ancient mariners forces us to reconsider what we mean by advanced technology. Is advancement measured by material complexity or by the sophistication of knowledge required to create and use that technology? A smartphone is materially complex, but requires no understanding from its user. A composite rope-bound boat is materially simple, but demands comprehensive understanding of materials, construction techniques, and ocean conditions. By that measure, the ancient mariners of Southeast Asia possessed technology that was astonishingly advanced, not in material complexity, but in the depth of knowledge and skill required to create and use it successfully. They understood their environment in ways modern people can barely comprehend. They read the ocean like we read street signs. They navigated by subtle cues we wouldn't even notice. They built boats from materials we'd consider impossible to use. And they did it 40,000 years ago, when conventional wisdom placed them somewhere between primitive and barely competent. The implications extend beyond Southeast Asia. If humans possessed sophisticated maritime technology 40,000 years ago in the Philippines, what about other coastal regions? Africa has a long coastline with evidence of early human occupation. Europe has coastal sites with fish remains dating back tens of thousands of years. South America shows evidence of early coastal settlements. Were all of these populations more maritime than we've credited them? The archaeological record is biased towards stone. Stone tools preserve, wooden tools decay, rope disintegrates, boats disappear, which means we have massive blind spots when it comes to understanding ancient organic technology. We can see the stone tools used to make rope, but not the rope itself. We can see the fish remains that prove ocean voyaging, but not the boats that caught them. What we're discovering on Mindoro is that if you look closely enough, if you examine stone tools under microscopes, if you analyze wear patterns and use damage, if you study the distribution of marine species in archaeological contexts, you can reconstruct technologies that left no direct physical trace. You can glimpse the sophisticated maritime cultures that existed in the deep past. And what we're finding is that humans were far more capable, far earlier than anyone expected. The capacity for complex technology, for long-term planning, for coordinated social activity, these aren't recent developments. They've been part of human nature for tens of thousands of years. We just couldn't see the evidence because we were looking in the wrong places. The Mindoro Archaeology project changed that. 15 years of systematic excavation and analysis revealed a window into an ancient world where the ocean was highway rather than barrier, where boats were essential technology, where navigation was survival skill, and where human communities thrived by mastering the maritime environment. The stone tools with their microscopic plant fibre traces, the bone hooks worn smooth by use, the net weights showing cordage attachment points, the tuna and shark bones proving deep-sea fishing, the obsidian from distant islands, the shell adzes matching tools thousands of kilometres away, the burial practices shared across vast distances. Each piece of evidence adds to the picture of a sophisticated maritime culture operating at a level we never imagined possible for Stone Age peoples. This isn't speculation. This isn't theoretical reconstruction. This is hard archaeological evidence, published in peer-reviewed journals, backed by multiple lines of evidence, and supported by experimental archaeology that proves the techniques could work. The boats could be built with available materials. The rope could hold up to ocean conditions. The navigation could work with environmental cues alone. The deep-sea fishing could be accomplished with bone hooks and plant fibre lines. It all works, which means it probably happened. The ancient mariners of 40,000 years ago were doing exactly what the archaeological evidence suggests they were doing. They were building sophisticated boats, crossing open ocean, catching deep-sea fish, trading across vast distances, and creating maritime cultures that would persist for thousands of years. And then something changed. Around 10,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, the maritime networks of islands Southeast Asia adapted to new conditions. Many islands that had been exposed during glacial periods were submerged. Coastlines shifted. The ocean geography that ancient mariners had known for 30,000 years transformed within a few thousand years. But the maritime tradition survived. New boat designs evolved. Navigation techniques adapted to changed conditions. The fundamental knowledge passed down through generations continued to flow from teacher to student, from parent to child, from experienced navigator to apprentice learning the craft. By the time written history begins in Southeast Asia, maritime trade was already ancient and well established. Chinese records from 2,000 years ago describe sophisticated Southeast Asian vessels engaged in long-distance trade across the Indian Ocean. Arab geographers 1,000 years ago wrote about the maritime prowess of Southeast Asian navigators and the quality of their ships. But the roots of this maritime culture extend back tens of thousands of years before any of those records. Back to Mindoro and the other islands, where stone tools bear microscopic traces of ancient rope making. Back to the bone hooks and net weights that prove deep-sea fishing. Back to the fish bones that demonstrate ocean-worthy boats. Back to the trading networks that connected distant islands. Back to the burial practices that show shared culture across vast distances. The ancient mariners of Southeast Asia didn't leave written records. They didn't build monuments. They didn't create kingdoms that would be recorded in the annals of history. What they created was something more fundamental. They mastered the ocean. They developed technology sophisticated enough to transform seas from barriers into highways. They built a culture based on understanding rather than controlling their environment. And they did it all with stone, bone, shell, and plant fibers. No metal, no engines, no GPS. Just human knowledge, accumulated over countless generations, refined through experience, and passed down through cultural traditions that persist to this day. The stone tools found on Mindoro are now being studied by researchers around the world. The microscopic wear patterns are being compared to experimental archaeology results. The plant fiber traces are being analysed to identify which species were used for rope making. The fishing implements are being replicated and tested in actual ocean conditions. Every new analysis reveals more detail, more sophistication, more evidence that these ancient mariners knew exactly what they were doing and had been perfecting their craft for thousands of years before the archaeological record even begins. The Flow project continues, with researchers building increasingly accurate replicas of ancient boats and testing them in progressively more challenging conditions. Each test provides data about how these vessels would have handled in storms, high seas, and long-distance voyages. Each trial offers insight into what ancient crews would have experienced and how they would have managed their boats. And every result confirms that these ancient vessels were capable of far more than anyone previously believed. They weren't barely adequate craft that might, with luck, survive a short journey between islands. They were sophisticated designs that could handle sustained ocean voyaging in conditions that would challenge many modern recreational boats. The knowledge required to design and build such craft doesn't develop overnight. It requires generations of experimentation, refinement, and accumulated experience. The ancient mariners who built boats 40,000 years ago were working with knowledge passed down from even earlier generations, standing on the shoulders of innovators whose names we'll never know, but whose contributions made maritime civilization possible. And that's what the archaeological evidence from Mindoro reveals. Not a sudden breakthrough, not a flash of genius, but patient incremental development of technology and knowledge over time scales we can barely comprehend. Generation after generation, learning a little more, improving techniques, slightly passing knowledge forward to children and apprentices who would build on that foundation. This is how human advancement actually happens, not through sudden revolutions, but through countless small improvements accumulated over vast stretches of time. The ancient mariners of 40,000 years ago were building on knowledge that extended back to when humans first reached Southeast Asian coasts, and their descendants would continue that tradition for another 40,000 years into the present. The maritime cultures of Southeast Asia today maintain traditions with roots in that ancient past. Modern boat builders in the Philippines, Indonesia, and throughout the region still use techniques that would be recognizable to ancient craftspeople. The materials have changed, the designs have evolved, but the fundamental understanding remains. The ocean connects, boats make that connection possible, navigation skills make it reliable, and cultural knowledge, passed down through generations, makes it sustainable. These principles haven't changed. What worked 40,000 years ago still works today, refined and adapted, but fundamentally the same. The ancient mariners of Mindoro left us no written records, no monuments, no great works of architecture. What they left were stone tools bearing microscopic traces of plant fibres, bone hooks worn smooth by use, fish bones from species that live in deep ocean, shell adzes matching tools thousands of kilometres away, burial practices shared across vast distances. These humble remains tell a story more impressive than any monument. They reveal a maritime culture so sophisticated, so thoroughly adapted to their environment, so successful in their mastery of ocean navigation and boat building, that they sustained themselves for 35,000 years on islands that could only be reached by crossing open sea. They were skilled mariners when the rest of humanity was still learning to use fire effectively. They were building ocean-worthy boats when other humans were barely venturing from African shores. They were maintaining maritime trade networks across thousands of kilometres when most human cultures consisted of small isolated bands, and they did it all with technology so elegant, so perfectly adapted to available materials and environmental conditions that modern engineers building replicas with period-appropriate tools find themselves respecting the sophistication of ancient design choices. The boat shouldn't have been possible. The navigation shouldn't have worked. The deep-sea fishing shouldn't have succeeded. The maritime networks shouldn't have persisted across such vast distances and such long time periods. But the archaeological evidence proves they did. All of it, for 40,000 years. This is the story that microscopic scratches on 40,000-year-old stone tools reveal. This is what tuna and shark bones in ancient caves demonstrate. This is what shell adzes, separated by 3,000 kilometres, prove. This is what the Mindoro Archaeology Project uncovered after 15 years of systematic excavation and analysis. The ancient mariners of Southeast Asia built ocean-ready boats 40,000 years ago. They shouldn't exist in our timeline of human advancement. They shouldn't appear in the Paleolithic era. They shouldn't demonstrate sophistication that rivals much later civilizations. But they do, and every new archaeological discovery in the region confirms it. The maritime culture of ancient Southeast Asia was far more advanced, far earlier, than anyone believed possible. The conventional wisdom about Paleolithic technology being limited to Europe and Africa just got rewritten. Because 40,000 years ago, on islands that could only be reached by crossing open ocean, ancient mariners were building sophisticated boats, catching deep-sea fish, trading across vast distances, and creating a maritime civilization that would endure for thousands of years. The evidence is in the stone tools, the fish bones, the trading goods, the burial practices, the cultural knowledge that persists to this day. It's all there, waiting to be found by archaeologists, patient enough to look closely and open-minded enough to see what the evidence actually reveals. The ancient mariners of Southeast Asia were master boat builders, skilled navigators, and sophisticated technologists who understood their environment in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. They left no written records because they had no need for writing. Their knowledge was transmitted through demonstration and practice, from teacher to student, from parent to child, from expert to apprentice. And that knowledge works. The Flow project proves it. The experimental archaeology confirms it. The archaeological evidence supports it. The maritime traditions of modern Southeast Asian cultures preserve it. 40,000 years ago, they built boats that shouldn't exist, crossed oceans that shouldn't have been possible, created maritime networks that shouldn't have been sustainable, and thrived for millennia in a civilization based on mastery of the sea. The stone tools with their microscopic plant fiber traces are the key that unlocked this ancient story. Humble artifacts, easily overlooked, revealing through microscopic analysis a maritime culture of astonishing sophistication. They built ocean-ready boats 40,000 years ago, and now we know how they did it. But knowing how raises even more profound questions. Questions about why, about who these people were, about what drove them to risk everything crossing open ocean when they could have stayed on the mainland or on larger, safer islands. The answer probably lies in the nature of island Southeast Asia itself. The region is blessed with extraordinary marine biodiversity, coral reefs teeming with fish, deep ocean currents bringing nutrient-rich water close to shore, seasonal migrations of large pelagic species. For people with the skills to exploit these resources, the ocean offered abundance that few land-based environments could match. But there's also the human element, the drive to explore, to see what lies beyond the horizon, to discover new islands, new resources, new opportunities. This isn't purely rational economic calculation. This is something deeper in human nature. The curiosity that drives us to climb mountains, cross deserts, venture into unknown territory, even when staying put would be safer. The ancient mariners who first crossed to Mindoro weren't just seeking resources. They were explorers, pioneers pushing into unknown territory, risking their lives on the possibility that something better waited beyond the visible horizon. And when they succeeded, when they found islands rich with resources and potential, they established communities that would endure for thousands of years. Think about what that first crossing must have been like. Loading supplies into a boat made of wood and rope, hoping the bindings would hold, pushing off from a known shore into open ocean, with no guarantee of finding land before water and food ran out, watching the home island shrink behind you until it disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving nothing but endless ocean in all directions. The fear would have been overwhelming, every wave threatening to swamp the boat, every shift in wind direction raising questions about navigation. Every hour that passed without sighting land, increasing the possibility that you'd miscalculated, that there was no island ahead, that you were sailing into empty ocean where you'd die of thirst watching the sun bake you alive. But the ancient mariners had something that made them push through that fear. Knowledge, experience, confidence built through years of shorter voyages, working up to longer and more challenging crossings. They weren't reckless. They were skilled professionals who understood the risks and prepared accordingly. The boat crews probably included experienced navigators who'd made the crossing before, elders with decades of knowledge about ocean patterns, weather signs, and navigation techniques. Younger sailors learning the craft, watching, absorbing the lessons that couldn't be taught in words alone. Women and children sometimes, when the journey was to establish permanent settlements rather than just exploration or trading expeditions. These weren't military expeditions or single adventurers. These were communities on the move, carrying everything needed to establish new lives in unknown territory, seeds for planting, tools for building, knowledge of fire making, shelter construction, food preservation. The accumulated wisdom of generations packed into boats and carried across open ocean to start fresh on distant shores. And they succeeded, not just once, but repeatedly. The archaeological evidence shows waves of settlement, with new groups arriving at different times, bringing new technologies and ideas, mixing with existing populations, creating the cultural diversity that characterizes island Southeast Asia to this day. The Mindoro sites show this layering clearly. Earlier occupation levels with certain tool styles, later levels with new innovations, changes in burial practices over time, introduction of new materials through trade. The archaeological record is a timeline of cultural evolution, showing how communities adopted new technologies, and maintained connections with the wider world. One particularly fascinating aspect is the introduction of pottery. The earliest occupation levels at Mindoro lack ceramics entirely. All containers were made from organic materials like bamboo, gourds, and woven baskets. But around 4,000 years ago, pottery appears in the archaeological record. Not crude experimental attempts, but sophisticated ceramics showing mastery of the craft. This pottery didn't develop locally through gradual experimentation. It arrived fully formed, brought by people who already knew how to make it, probably migrants from Taiwan or mainland Southeast Asia, part of the Austronesian expansion that spread across the Pacific. These newcomers brought pottery technology, new agricultural techniques, and probably different languages and cultural practices. The existing populations of Mindoro didn't disappear. They absorbed the newcomers, adopted useful technologies, and continued their maritime traditions while incorporating new elements. The cultural exchange went both ways. The Austronesians brought pottery. The local populations shared their sophisticated maritime knowledge and understanding of local resources. This pattern of cultural exchange and adaptation repeats throughout the archaeological record. New technologies appearing, old traditions persisting, groups mixing and merging, and through it all the maritime culture remains central, because on islands, the ocean is life. Understanding boats and navigation isn't optional, it's survival. The fishing implements found at Mindoro show evolution over time. The earliest bone hooks are simple curved designs. Later versions show refinement, with better angles and more sophisticated barbs. Net weights become more standardized, suggesting specialized production. Harpoon points appear, indicating hunting of larger marine mammals. Each innovation represents someone observing, experimenting, improving on existing designs. This incremental improvement is the hallmark of mature technology, not revolutionary breakthroughs, but patient refinement of proven techniques. A slightly better angle on a fishhook that increases catch rates by a few percent. A different knot that holds more reliably under strain. A modification to boat design that makes handling easier in rough seas. Small changes that, accumulated over generations, result in sophisticated technology far superior to the earliest versions. The plant fiber processing shows similar evolution. The earliest stone tools show basic scraping and cutting marks. Later tools display more specialized wear patterns, indicating more refined techniques for fiber extraction and preparation. By the time pottery arrives, the rope-making technology has been perfected through 30,000 years of continuous development. 30,000 years. Think about that time span. Modern civilization, from the first cities to the present day, is only about 6,000 years. The ancient mariners of Mindoro had 5 times that duration to perfect their craft. 5 times longer than all of recorded history to refine their boat designs, improve their navigation techniques, and develop their understanding of the ocean. This vast timescale explains the sophistication. This isn't early-stage technology. This is mature technology, with thousands of generations of improvements behind it. By the time we see it in the archaeological record, it's already highly refined. The experimental phase happened so far in the past that we may never find evidence of it. The earliest boats were probably less capable, made by people still learning which materials worked best, which designs were most stable, which construction techniques produced the strongest bindings. There must have been failures, boats that fell apart in heavy seas, designs that capsized too easily, materials that degraded too quickly. The ancient mariners learned through trial and error, and the errors probably cost lives. But each generation learned from those mistakes. They modified designs, tested new materials, developed better techniques, and they passed that knowledge forward to their children, who would continue the process of refinement and improvement over centuries, over millennia, over time spans so vast that we can barely comprehend them. By 40,000 years ago, when we first see clear evidence of sophisticated maritime technology in the archaeological record, the people of Southeast Asia weren't novices. They were master craftspeople working with technology that had been in development for how long? We don't know. The evidence doesn't extend back far enough to see the origins. Modern humans reached Southeast Asia at least 70,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Did they possess maritime technology even then? The evidence is ambiguous, but by 40,000 years ago, there's no ambiguity. The plant fibre traces, the bone hooks, the deep ocean fish bones, it's all there, clear and unequivocal. These people were expert mariners, and they were spreading. The similar tool styles across island Southeast Asia suggest regular contact and exchange. The obsidian from Palawan found on Mindoro, the shell adzes matching designs thousands of kilometres away. The shared burial practices, all of this points to an interconnected maritime world where distance was measured not in kilometres, but in sailing time. A journey that might take weeks by boat would be completely impossible by land, but for maritime cultures, the ocean voyage was the practical route. Islands separated by deep water channels were actually closer, in practical terms, than locations separated by mountains or dense jungle. The ocean connected, the land divided. This inverts the normal geography of terrestrial cultures. For land-based peoples, rivers and valleys are highways. Mountains and seas are barriers. But for maritime cultures, the ocean is the highway. Land is just a place you anchor your boat and set up camp. The real world is the water, the currents, the winds, the waves. That's the environment you understand and navigate. This maritime worldview permeates the artifacts from Mindoro. The abundance of fishing gear, the presence of marine species in the diet, even though terrestrial animals were also available. The coastal settlement patterns, the orientation toward the sea. Everything suggests people whose lives centered on the ocean in ways that land-based cultures rarely achieve. Even the burial practices reflect this maritime focus. The 5,000-year-old grave on Island Island, with its limestone slab construction and fetal position burial, mimics burial styles found across Southeast Asia. But the location matters. The grave is near the coast, within sight and sound of the ocean. For people whose lives revolved around the sea, even death didn't separate them from the waves. The limestone slabs used in the burial had to be quarried and transported to the burial site. This required effort and planning. The deceased was important enough to merit careful burial with proper materials. The fetal position suggests beliefs about death and rebirth. The covering slabs protected the body. Every element shows care and cultural significance. Burial practices reveal how people thought about death, the afterlife, and the relationship between the living and the dead. The Mindoro burials suggest beliefs that death was a transition rather than an ending. The careful positioning of the body, the protective covering, the location near the ocean, all of this indicates cultural sophistication and spiritual beliefs that extended beyond mere physical survival. These ancient mariners weren't just technologically sophisticated, they had rich cultural lives, with beliefs and practices that gave meaning to their existence. They told stories around fires at night. They taught their children about the ocean and the ancestors. They celebrated successful voyages and mourned those lost at sea. They created a culture as sophisticated as their technology, though the stories and songs left no archaeological trace. We can imagine those stories. Tales of the first voyagers who discovered new islands. Legends of great storms survived through skill and courage. Stories of sea monsters and strange creatures encountered in deep water. Heroes who navigated by reading signs no one else could see. Tragic love stories of sailors lost at sea and the families who waited for their return. The full richness of oral tradition passed down through generations, giving cultural depth to the technical knowledge. Some of those stories might persist today in the myths and legends of modern Southeast Asian maritime cultures. Stories about culture heroes who taught people how to build boats, legends about the first navigators who discovered the safe routes between islands, myths explaining why the tides rise and fall, why the winds blow from different directions, why certain fish migrate at certain times. Ancient knowledge encoded in narrative form, surviving long after the original context was forgotten. The modern maritime cultures of Southeast Asia maintain practices that almost certainly trace back to this ancient heritage. Traditional boat designs show continuity with archaeological evidence, navigation techniques using natural signs rather than instruments, understanding of seasonal weather patterns and ocean currents. All of this knowledge, passed down through countless generations, maintains living connections to that ancient past. When modern traditional navigators in the Philippines, Indonesia, or elsewhere in Southeast Asia take apprentices to sea and teach them to read the waves, recognize weather patterns, and find their way by stars and currents, they're continuing a tradition 40,000 years old. The specific techniques have evolved, the boats have changed, but the fundamental knowledge remains the same. The ocean follows patterns, those patterns can be learned, and with that knowledge, people can travel vast distances across open water safely. This living tradition provides insight into what the ancient mariners knew, and how they transmitted that knowledge. Modern training involves years of apprenticeship, countless hours at sea observing conditions, learning to recognize subtle patterns that landlubbers never notice, developing intuition based on experience that's difficult to explain in words. This can't be learned from books, it has to be experienced. The ancient training must have been similar. Young people going to sea with experienced elders, watching, learning, asking questions, making mistakes in safe conditions, gradually building the knowledge and confidence needed to navigate independently. This person-to-person transmission is how cultural knowledge persists across generations, even without writing. But it's also fragile. If transmission is interrupted, if a generation fails to teach the next, the knowledge can be lost completely. This nearly happened in many places where modern navigation technology made traditional skills seem obsolete. Why learn to read the stars when you have GPS? Why understand ocean currents when you have engine-powered boats? Fortunately, there's been a resurgence of interest in traditional navigation and boat-building techniques, cultural preservation projects, academic studies, community initiatives to document and teach traditional knowledge. The Flow project in the Philippines is part of this broader movement to understand and preserve maritime heritage. These modern efforts provide validation for the ancient mariners. When researchers build replicas using traditional materials and find that the boats work, when they test ancient navigation techniques and discover they're accurate, when they examine the knowledge embedded in traditional practices and find it scientifically sound, they're confirming that the ancient mariners knew what they were doing. This wasn't luck or accident. This was sophisticated understanding of natural systems, encoded in cultural practices and transmitted through generations. The archaeological evidence from Mindoro is a snapshot of this knowledge system. The stone tools with their microscopic wear patterns capture one moment in a continuum of development, stretching back into prehistory and forward into the present. The bone hooks and net weights represent refinements of techniques developed over millennia. The fish bones demonstrate successful application of that knowledge. The trade goods show the broader maritime networks that knowledge made possible. But the most important lesson from Mindoro is about human capability. We consistently underestimate what ancient peoples could achieve. We assume that lack of modern technology meant lack of capability, but the evidence shows the opposite. Ancient peoples were every bit as intelligent and capable as modern humans. They just worked with different tools and operated in different contexts. The ancient mariners of Southeast Asia didn't have GPS, but they understood ocean patterns well enough to navigate thousands of kilometers accurately. They didn't have power tools, but they could shape wood and bone into sophisticated implements. They didn't have marine biology textbooks, but they knew fish behavior and ecology intimately. They didn't have weather satellites, but they could read atmospheric and oceanic signs to predict conditions. In some ways, they understood their environment better than most modern people, because their survival depended on that understanding directly. A mistake in navigation meant death at sea. A failure in boat construction meant drowning. Misreading weather signs meant getting caught in storms. The stakes were absolute. There was no margin for error. So they learned. They paid attention. They developed deep understanding through necessity and refined it through generations of accumulated experience. This kind of knowledge is being lost in many places as modern technology makes traditional skills seem unnecessary. But it's knowledge worth preserving, not just for cultural heritage reasons, but because it represents profound understanding of natural systems. Understanding that could inform modern approaches to sustainability, resource management, and living in harmony with the environment rather than dominating it. The ancient mariners of Mindoro thrived for 40,000 years by understanding and working within natural systems. They didn't try to conquer the ocean. They learned its patterns and adapted to them. They didn't extract resources until they were depleted. They maintained sustainable practices that allowed populations to continue for millennia. They didn't isolate themselves. They maintained connections across vast distances through trade and cultural exchange. This is the real achievement revealed by the archaeological evidence. Not just that they built sophisticated boats 40,000 years ago, but that they created a sustainable maritime culture that persisted for longer than all of recorded civilization. That success on a scale modern cultures have yet to match. We measure advancement in material complexity, faster boats, more powerful engines, satellite navigation. But the ancient mariners would measure advancement differently. Can your knowledge sustain your culture for 40,000 years? Can your practices maintain resources for 1,000 generations? Can your community thrive without depleting the environment that supports it? By those measures, the ancient mariners of Southeast Asia achieved something we're still trying to figure out. They created a way of life that was genuinely sustainable over timescales we can barely comprehend, and they did it by understanding their environment deeply, respecting natural limits, and passing knowledge forward carefully to ensure each generation could continue the traditions. The stone tools from Mindoro represent all of this. They're not just archaeological curiosities, they're physical evidence of a successful approach to human existence that modern societies could learn from. Evidence that sophistication doesn't require material complexity. Evidence that deep understanding of natural systems can support thriving cultures. Evidence that humans have been capable of remarkable achievements for far longer than conventional timelines suggest, and evidence that there's still much to learn from the past. The microscopic plant fibre traces on those 40,000-year-old tools are teaching us things we never knew about ancient maritime technology. The bone hooks and net weights are revealing sophisticated fishing techniques. The fish remains are demonstrating unexpected capabilities. Every new analysis uncovers more sophistication. What else don't we know? What other ancient achievements are waiting to be discovered in the archaeological record? What other misconceptions about the past need to be overturned by careful analysis of humble artifacts? The story of Mindoro's ancient mariners is still being written. Each new excavation adds details. Each laboratory analysis reveals more information. Each experimental archaeology project tests hypotheses about how the technology actually worked. The picture becomes clearer and more impressive with each new study. But the fundamental revelation is already clear. 40,000 years ago, people in Southeast Asia were building sophisticated ocean-going boats, maintaining maritime trade networks across thousands of kilometers, and creating a culture as advanced as anything found in Europe or Africa at the same time. They just used different technologies, left different archaeological traces, and have been overlooked by historians who didn't know where or how to look for evidence. The Mindoro Archaeology Project changed that. 15 years of systematic work revealed a maritime civilization that rewrites our understanding of human technological development. And it all started with scratches on stone tools, too small to see without magnification. Humble evidence of extraordinary achievement. They built ocean-ready boats 40,000 years ago. They shouldn't exist in our timeline of human advancement. But they do, and now we're finally beginning to understand just how sophisticated these ancient mariners really were.